Cancer is among the leading causes of death worldwide. An estimated 1.7 million Americans have been afflicted each year, and 600,000 have been killed by this disease. Throughout world history, scientists have been researching cures for cancer, and it was not until World War II that chemotherapy was discovered as a possible treatment. The development of chemotherapy in the 1940s was a triumph in cancer research that pushed it to new heights, but was also tragedy in the side effects, inconsistency, and costly expense of the cancer treatment. Today, researchers continue to discover new methods of treatment for a triumph in the war on cancer. Cancer is not one disease. It is a collection of related diseases, but each of them grows the same way, starting anywhere in the human body and forming tumors that evade the immune system. Some of the earliest evidence of cancer is found in fossilized bone tumors and ancient manuscripts. People often misunderstood this seemingly incurable disease, theorizing that it sprung from trauma and that it spread through parasites. As the 20th century dawned, surgery and radiotherapy became the accepted methods to treat them. They were effective in removing early-stage local cancers, but otherwise, there is no cure for those who had advanced invasive tumors. These limitations called for more systemic treatment that would attack the spread of cancer. In the early 1900s, German chemist Paul Ehrlich discovered a selective drug that targeted syphilis. He became the first person to coin the word chemotherapy, defining it as the use of chemicals to cure disease. Yet unlike syphilis, the similarity of cancer cells to normal human cells made it impossible to target.
Cancer is a foreign body. Our body is supposed to fight it off, like it fights bacteria, the fungus, the parasites, and so forth. But because the cancer creates the environment which is self-protective, it kind of switches off the immune response of the body to a cancer.
20 years later, with World War II looming, the United States Army was asked to develop protective measures against mustard gas, and discovered it can work against cancer. This led scientists in the post-war period to realize that chemicals can destroy the cancer and cure the patient by damaging its DNA. However, there was still pessimism around chemotherapy because of the medical mysteries that surrounded it and the systematic neglect of cancer research. In 1937, Fortune magazine published an article titled "Cancer, the Great Darkness," contrasting the stagnation of research funds to the rise in cancer. One story of cancer lies in a young 3-year-old boy afflicted with leukemia. His name was Robert Sandler, an identical twin and son of a working-class family. In the winter of 1947, Robert was brought to the Children's Hospital in Boston. Like other hospitals, it had a morgue for leukemic children. There was nothing that doctors could offer to the young patients. He was put under the care of Sidney Farber, who, influenced by the mustard gas trials, was researching a new drug to cure this seemingly incurable disease. Farber injected a drug called aminopterin on Robert and 15 other children, hoping it would block the growth of leukemic cells.
Leukemia was considered to be an absolutely fatal disease, and nobody thought that anyone would survive.
10 of the children, including Robert, had miraculous improvements. Farber reported these results in the June 3, 1948 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. Robert's activity, alertness, and nutrition are equal to or better than those of a well twin. Many in the scientific community reacted to the news of a mixture of disbelief and resistance. It seemed presumptuous for a young pathologist with very little funding to find an effective treatment against non-solid tumors. Among practicing physicians and pediatricians, his discovery in chemotherapy was remarkable, and this helped strengthen the impact of drugs in cancer treatment.
Farber began to wonder whether to bring cancer alive in the public imagination, whether one needed to do more than just being a scientist. And it's this capacity of Farber, the capacity of Farber to come outside the laboratory and to become engaged in a much larger public conversation around cancer that occurs in America in the 1960s.
His vision extends beyond his laboratory.
He was determined to create a research program around chemotherapy to conquer cancer, and believed that the only thing standing in its way was sustained research, sufficient funding, and the national will to bring it about. Sidney Farber would be partnering up with Mary Lasker, an activist and philanthropist. Post-war prosperity and rising public expectations of good health provided a force for Lasker's efforts to reshape cancer research funding.
She felt that you had to have money to get people working on a problem. She once called money frozen energy. And I think it's an apt description. It's perfect.
Influenced by Farber, she embraced chemotherapy and convinced the Senate to build a program to find chemotherapeutic drugs in a more directed manner within the National Cancer Institute. The triumph of chemotherapy from Farber's trials made cancer research a bigger priority for Americans, but it also revealed the adverse effects of the poisonous treatments.
But the problem is that cancer is not a local disease. It's not like something which grows in one place. There are always possibility of cells which are lodged somewhere else.
At the Children's Hospital, Farber was doing everything he possibly could to cure the children, but was making little progress. The children only had remissions of leukemia because the cancer cells developed resistance against aminopterin, including Robert, who would die in 1949, 15 months after receiving the treatment. 10 years later, researchers at the National Cancer Institute experimented with a four-drug combination called VAMP, hoping it would prolong the short remissions of Farber's trials.
And if you can imagine a 4-year-old child in his mother's arms, bleeding to death, that's what we had to face.
The researchers received backlash for seemingly pushing the children to their deaths. To Farber, the suffering inflicted was far from what he could cross. Yet some of the children began to recover, and unlike his trials, the remissions lasted. The tragedies of the chemotherapy trials led to further progress for the treatments.
An enormous amount of progress in the last 20 years, which can be measured in the actual saving of human lives.
By the summer of 1969, Americans walked on the moon, and national faith in science soared. This new attitude, combined with the reports on the curability of cancer and chemotherapy, resulted in the passage of the National Cancer Act in 1971 by President Richard Nixon.
I believe that direct presidential interest and presidential guidance may hasten the day that we will find a cure for cancer.
The act expanded the authority of the National Cancer Institute and created a new Cancer Advisory Board, representing the U.S. commitment to what President Nixon described as the war on cancer. Triumph of chemotherapy launched a new era of cancer treatment that would continue to impact millions of individuals today. The landscape of drug development transformed as the market for cancer drugs grew. Chemotherapy became more systematically used, and this influenced an increase in the survival rates for cancer victims. According to the National Cancer Institute, the percentage of cancer patients surviving at least 5 years in the United States went from about 39% in 1963 to 70% in 2013. However, tragedy continues to lie within its side effects and expensive costs. Many individuals depend on chemotherapy to treat their cancer, but are unable to afford its treatment.
When people are poor, they have to pay attention to day-to-day priorities.
Because cancer cells can resist drugs, researchers continue to spend millions of dollars to discover new ones. To recoup the price, the cost of drugs is increased at unprecedented levels. In 1980, it was less than $1,000, and by 2017, the price went up to more than $10,000.
Priorities which force poor people to put off seeing the doctor.
People with low socioeconomic backgrounds may not be able to afford treating their cancer. There is also continuity in the side effects that result from chemotherapy. Patients often respond with adverse effects like fatigue and hair loss during their treatments. The triumph of chemotherapy in cancer research and the tragedy in its inconsistencies have paved the way for continued progress. Researchers have created stronger treatments by combining chemotherapy with other forms of therapy, like targeted therapy and immunotherapy. However, it is a form of treatment only a few can afford. Chemotherapy's development has taught us that we must not fear the unknown, because triumph can only happen collectively with tragedy.